First of all, it's a pleasure to be with longtime friends on this stage, and thank you for the invitation to come back, Daniel. I want to bridge the two conversations, if I may. I think more than as an act of historical curiosity, all of us need to return to an earlier period in history, particularly the 1920s and 1930s, in order to understand the lessons that were missed then that apply today. The first of which was a failure of imagination, an unwillingness and inability to believe that Adolf Hitler, who spelled out his manifesto in the Landsberg prison in 1924, actually meant what he said when he took office 9 years later. In fact, the New York Times, when he was released from prison, had a headline which read, "Hitler tamed by prison." And the article went on to say that it was expected that Hitler would retire to his native Austria. Do we dare suffer from a failure of imagination again 100 years later? The second lesson that I've learned from this period was the obvious failure of appeasement policy. Now, this has become a cliche, we all say it, and yet there are echoes, at least to me, of a failure to apply those lessons then to today. Edward Daladier was the Prime Minister of France who on September 30th, 1938, after meeting with Hitler in Munich said, and I quote, "Peace is saved." And I don't have to repeat the quotes of Neville Chamberlain upon his return to Britain and the reassurance to the British people they could get a good night's sleep because he returned with peace, with honor. The third lesson I learned was that when America seeks to create the distance of an ocean and the appearance of neutrality, not wanting again to get involved in Europe as it did in World War I, and grappling with the domestic issues of depression, etc., the world becomes a more dangerous place. And number four, as a Jew, I learned that a world without Israel is a more unsafe place, and not just for the Jews. And now I fast forward. On October the 7th, in American demographic terms, 42,000 people were killed. In American demographic terms, more than 8,000 Americans, if you will, were kidnapped. I asked my friend, the Minister of Defense of Greece, I ask anyone else here in this hall whose portfolio includes defense, how would you react to 42,000 people being killed on your soil in one day, the worst day since the Holocaust? And then I hear earlier today that we need to understand, Daniel, the root causes. One of your earlier speakers said, and then he tried to explain that the root cause of October 7th was occupation. Forgive me. The root cause of October 7th was our inability to understand the ideology of Hamas, its patrons in Tehran, its funders in Qatar, and its driving worldview drawn from the Muslim Brotherhood. Because occupation ended in 2005. And then he went on to say the solution is a two-state settlement. Who in their right mind would oppose an enduring, stable two-state solution? But that has been on the international table since 1947. Since UN Resolution 181 put a two-state solution on the table for the first of multiple times. So I fear that once again, in some respects, we're seeing a failure of imagination. We're ducking the issue. The issue is Iran. The issue is Iranian tentacles in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, and yes, here in Europe. And what can Europe do to advance its security? Well, for one thing, not avoid, but confront. Why is the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, not listed on the EU terrorism list? And why, since 2013, have we lived with this fiction of a Hezbollah that is divided between a military wing that, because of Bulgarian and Cypriot pressure, was added to the EU list, while a political wing is not? As if one can bifurcate an organization that Hezbollah itself insists is a unitary organization. So I believe that we have to not risk, once again, the failure of imagination, not risk making Israel the new Czechoslovakia, but understanding as well that Israel is not just a benefit to the United States or to the Jewish community, but I ask you, I ask the ministers of defense and others, after Israel was attacked on October the 7th, the IDF called for 300,000 reservists to show up. 350,000 reservists showed up from every corner of the world, including several veterans in their 90s. How many countries in our transatlantic community would have that kind of response? What can we learn from Israel? How about national resilience in the home front, since after all, Hamas targeted the home front? How about missile defense? How about military operability in high-density urban zones? Israel should never become a sacrificial lamb. Israel is essential to the security of Europe, just as the United States is, and my last and final point. A lot's been said about the election in the United States. I am one of the last dinosaurs, a political independent and a nonpartisan. And I have only two hopes for this election. One, that whoever wins, wins decisively enough that it doesn't end up in the Supreme Court. And the second, and this may surprise some of you, I'm hoping for divided government. Given the political extremes in the United States, the unwillingness of either side to meet in the middle, the only way to force that encounter, I believe, on a policy level is just that. And with respect to NATO, should Donald Trump return, I want to assure people in this hall and watching on live stream that there are a hell of a lot of us, from the Admiral to George to myself, partisan and nonpartisan, who are going to fight like hell to make sure that we don't return to a neo-isolationist policy of the 1930s, because otherwise I don't want ever again to have a future Winston Churchill saying, and the conversation took place with President Roosevelt, and Churchill wrote, "One day President Roosevelt told me that he was asking publicly for suggestions about the war should be called. I, Winston Churchill, said 2 words, unnecessary war." Through unity, through the end of a failure of imagination, through abandonment of appeasement, through strengthening our spine, our collaborative spine, through understanding that soft power without hard power today is no power. That through this kind of combined efforts on both sides of the Atlantic, with friends on the other side, whatever happens in November, we will prevail for only one reason, because we must.